Beneath the vegetable rows of a working research farm in the Blue Ridge foothills, a piece of quartz surfaces in the soil. It's small, sharpened, unremarkable to anyone not looking for it. A farm manager notices the edge. He shouldn't have been able to, not after 8,000 years underground. This is Ashe County, North Carolina, and what starts as a stray artifact in garden dirt becomes something else entirely once archaeologists arrive. A hearth, a storage pit, spear points in 5 different kinds of stone, and a pattern old enough to predate almost every road, trail, and highway in the region. The claim building around this site is bold. That buried somewhere in this farmland is evidence of one of the oldest continuously used travel corridors in North America. Not a settlement, a crossroads. A place people kept returning to, generation after generation, long before anyone wrote anything down. Long before any surveyor drove a stake into this ground, long before any farmer ever turned this soil with a plow, someone else was already standing here, deciding this exact patch of earth was worth coming back to. But bold claims deserve scrutiny, not applause. Before this becomes the story of America's oldest travel routes, it has to survive the same question every discovery like it eventually faces. What does the evidence actually prove? And what part of the story is still just a good guess? That's not a small question. It's the difference between a headline and a fact, and by the end of this, you'll be able to tell which one this discovery actually is. The story starts small, almost accidentally. The Blackburn Vannoy estate and farm sits near Fleetwood in Ashe County, a 369-acre teaching and research property owned by Appalachian State University and worked by actual students and staff. Not a roped-off historical site. It grows crops. It runs livestock research. It has a barn that's been standing for a century. This is not the kind of ground people expect to yield the Ice Age. That's what makes the discovery land differently. Workers on the farm, including the farm director and a resident manager, were tending garden soil when they noticed something that didn't belong there, stone-shaped with intention, not by weather or plow. They brought it to Dr. Alice Wright, an anthropological archaeologist at App State who had already spent years studying the human history of the New River Basin, the wider watershed this farm sits inside. Wright examined the piece herself. A sharpened fragment of quartz, likely worked by hand, possibly broken during a hunt, and later repurposed as a scraper for hides. Small, damaged, and still legible after thousands of years in the ground. It was enough to stop the farm's usual rhythm and start a different kind of work. Wright didn't treat it as a curiosity for a shelf. She treated it as a question the ground might still be able to answer if someone was willing to dig carefully enough to hear it. Most farms with a history this old never get the chance to prove it. This one did, because someone paused long enough to look twice at a piece of stone that almost got tossed aside with the weeds. Farms turn up strange rocks constantly. Almost none of them turn into a research project spanning years and a dozen student careers. The difference here wasn't the rock, it was who happened to be looking at it. On thousands of other farms across this same region, artifacts just like this one have almost certainly already been tossed into a fence row or plowed under without a second thought, simply because nobody nearby knew what they were looking at. What came next wasn't a treasure hunt, it was a field school. The kind of slow, supervised excavation that turns undergraduates into archaeologists 1 square meter at a time. Wright assembled a team of a dozen student researchers and set them to work beneath the farm's vegetable garden, just under the depth a plow could reach. That detail matters. Shallow enough to have been missed for generations, deep enough to have stayed sealed. The students learned to mark boundaries, screen soil, and document position before lifting anything. The same unglamorous discipline that separates a real excavation from a lucky find. It's slow work by design. Every layer removed is a layer that can't be put back, so nothing gets rushed. Over the course of the dig, the site started giving up more than anyone expected from a working farm. Not one artifact, dozens. Wright has spent years mapping how ancient peoples used the wider New River Basin, and this farm now became her most active classroom for that research. Students sifted soil by hand, some finding their first intact points within days, others learning patience the hard way, screening for hours before anything surfaced. What made the site worth this level of care wasn't a single dramatic object. It was the accumulation, hearth remnants, tool fragments, and stone from multiple sources, all packed into one patch of ground that had clearly been visited again and again, long before this farm existed in any form anyone alive would recognize. For students used to reading about archaeology in textbooks, this was the first time the past had ever pushed back against a trowel in their own hands. Careers in this field are built on exactly this kind of unglamorous repetition. Kneeling in the same square of dirt for hours, learning to see the difference between a rock and a tool long before it becomes obvious to anyone else standing nearby. What came out of the ground reads like a working campsite frozen mid-use. A stone hearth, the kind of feature that only exists because someone built a fire in the same spot repeatedly, not once, but across seasons, maybe across generations. Beside it, a storage pit. A hollow dug into the earth for keeping something safe, food, tools, materials worth protecting from weather and scavengers. Around both features, the debris of actual tool making. Fire-cracked rock, stone that fractures in a distinct way when repeatedly heated and cooled. Evidence of cooking or maintaining a fire over time rather than a single passing visit. Spear points and arrow points turned up in 5 different kinds of stone: quartz, quartzite, rhyolite, flint, and jasper. Some were broken, some intact, some clearly reworked into new tools once their original use wore out. Pottery shards were mixed into the same layers, fragments of vessels that once held or carried something now long gone. None of this reads as ceremonial or symbolic. It reads as domestic. People cooking, storing, repairing tools, discarding what broke. The kind of ordinary residue that only survives because the ground sealed it and nobody plowed deep enough to scatter it. A garden had been growing directly above a campsite for who knows how many decades before anyone noticed the ground was trying to tell them something. Ordinary life leaves the faintest trace of all, which is exactly why finding this much of it intact in one place is so unusual. Dramatic sites get remembered. Ordinary ones almost never survive long enough to be found at all, which makes this particular patch of undisturbed dirt more valuable than it looks. The artifacts don't come from one moment. They come from a stretch of time so wide it's hard to hold in your head at once. Roughly 8,000 years down to about 1,000 years ago, spanning what archaeologists call the Late Archaic through the Woodland period. That range isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between a single family passing through once and dozens of generations choosing the same patch of ground over and over, across a span of time longer than recorded human history in most parts of the world. A site like that isn't a snapshot. It's a palimpsest, one layer of use written over another, then another, until the ground itself becomes a kind of ledger. Nobody camped here once and moved on for good. People kept coming back, generation after generation, to the same terrace above the same stream, near the same river, long enough for the evidence to stack instead of scatter. That pattern raises a harder question than a single find ever could. What kept pulling people back to this exact spot, decade after decade, culture after culture, for thousands of years, when the surrounding landscape offered no shortage of other ground to camp on? The answer isn't buried in any one artifact. It's buried in the choice itself. Repeated so many times, it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a root. Entire civilizations rose and fell elsewhere on the continent during that same stretch of time, while this one quiet terrace just kept doing what it had always done. Empires elsewhere on the planet rose and collapsed within centuries. This terrace outlasted several of them without anyone ever needing to build a monument to explain why it mattered. The stone itself starts telling a second story, one that has nothing to do with when people were here and everything to do with where they'd been. Most of the points recovered from the site are quartz, quartzite, and rhyolite, materials that occur naturally in the nearby Piedmont region or around the Mount Rogers area, not far as the crow flies, but far enough that carrying it here was a choice, not an accident. The flint and jasper are the harder pieces to explain away. Those materials don't occur locally at all. The most likely source sits across the state line, in outcrops in Virginia, meaning whoever shaped those tools either traveled there directly or acquired the stone through some kind of exchange with people who had. Neither option is small. Both mean this farm sat inside a network that stretched well beyond what any single family could forage on foot in an afternoon. Stone tools don't wander on their own. Someone carried that flint, that jasper, across a landscape most people today picture as empty wilderness before European contact, when the evidence says otherwise. It was a landscape people were actively moving through, trading across, and returning to with material gathered from places outside their immediate reach. That detail turns this from a story about one camp into a story about a connection, a thread linking this particular terrace to a wider world of foot travel and exchange most of the historical record never bothered to write down. A rock doesn't care about state lines. It only moves when a person decides it's worth the walk. Every mile that Flint traveled to end up in this soil is a mile someone chose to cover on foot, carrying weight through mountain terrain that offers no shortcuts. There was no wagon, no pack animal, no road to ease the distance. Just a person, a load of stone, and a route they clearly already knew well enough to trust. Wright's own explanation for why people kept returning here centers on something simpler than trade routes or stone sourcing: geography. The site sits on a terrace, elevated just enough above a stream running downslope to stay dry when the water rose. The new river itself is close, about half a mile away, near enough to matter, far enough to stay safe from its floodplain. In a region defined by steep grades and narrow valleys, a flat, elevated terrace beside reliable water isn't a small advantage. It's the difference between a camp that floods every spring and one that survives. Wright describes the river as functioning as a main travel corridor for the people who use this land. Less like a landmark and more like infrastructure, a route that made movement through otherwise difficult terrain manageable. That reframes the entire site. It's not simply that people liked this spot. It's that this spot sat at a junction, close enough to water to travel by, elevated enough to camp safely, positioned along a natural line of movement through the mountains, rather than tucked away from it. Ancient people were not choosing isolation. They were choosing access, a place to pause along a route they were already using to move through the region, season after season, for reasons that had everything to do with survival and very little to do with permanence. Every modern hiker who has ever picked a campsite for the same reasons, flat ground, water nearby, shelter from the wind, has unknowingly repeated a decision made on this exact terrace thousands of years earlier. Good geography doesn't expire. It just waits for the next person smart enough to recognize it. This isn't the first time this stretch of river basin has given up its history under pressure. Back in the 1970s, a hydroelectric project proposed building 2 dams on the new river, a plan that would have flooded thousands of acres across Ashe and neighboring Allegheny County. Before that flooding could happen, archaeologists raced to document whatever sat in the project's path, logging more than 100 sites along the river system before the dam plan was ultimately called off. Those surveys sat mostly untouched for decades. Boxes of records and recovered material describing a landscape that was never actually submerged, preserved by a project that never got built. Wright and her students have spent the last 2 years going back through that older work, treating a decades-old paper trail as its own kind of excavation. It means this farm's discovery isn't an isolated data point. It's one confirmed piece inside a much larger, already documented pattern of ancient use running up and down the same river basin. Wright plans to return to those older survey sites using tools that didn't exist in the 1970s. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometers, technology that can find what's buried without ever breaking ground. The goal isn't just one farm's story. It's stitching together a fuller picture of how this entire river corridor was used, camp by camp, generation by generation, using evidence that was sitting in a filing cabinet decades before anyone dug a single new trench. In a strange way, the dams that never got built ended up protecting more history than the dams themselves ever could have destroyed. Nobody planned it that way. A canceled infrastructure project from half a century ago is quietly funding the archaeology of today, simply because someone bothered to document the ground before assuming it would disappear. Zoom out far enough, and this farm stops looking unusual. Long before European contact, the wider Appalachian region was threaded with footpaths connecting dozens of settlements, worn into the landscape by generations of use rather than built by any single hand. Some of those paths, like the network historians now call the Great Indian Warpath, ran for hundreds of miles through the mountain valleys, used for travel, trade, and movement between distant communities. What happened to those paths afterward matters just as much as what they were. Many became the wagon roads that settlers carved through the same mountain passes centuries later, and some of those wagon roads became the basic circuitry of the highways people drive today. That pattern, footpath to wagon road to modern route, isn't speculation. It's documented, traceable, and repeated across the region. Seen against that backdrop, a seasonal camp positioned beside a river corridor, sitting on artifacts spanning 8,000 years, stops looking like an isolated curiosity. It starts looking like one confirmed point on a much older network, a network that shaped where later roads went because the terrain itself only ever offered so many workable paths through the mountains. The land didn't change. The people crossing it did, again and again, leaving each generation's roots as the groundwork for the next one's roads. Drive any modern highway through these mountains today, and there's a real chance the asphalt is following a decision someone else made on foot thousands of years before the road existed. Engineers didn't invent the easiest way through this terrain. They inherited it, mile by mile, from people who'd already tested every alternative on foot centuries earlier. Here's where the story has to slow down, because this is where the biggest claim gets tested. Nothing found on this farm proves it sits on the oldest travel route in America. That phrase is a hook, not a finding, and it's worth being honest about the difference. What Wright's own research actually supports is narrower, and in its own way, more solid. A site used repeatedly across 8,000 years, stone carried or traded from outside the immediate area, a location that made sense along a river corridor people were already moving through. Her word for it is Crossroads, not oldest route in the country. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. A crossroads is provable. It's sitting in the artifact record, the stone sourcing, the layered dates. Oldest is a superlative, and superlatives require ruling out every other site in a continent that hasn't finished being excavated. Nobody has done that here, and Wright hasn't claimed otherwise. That doesn't make the discovery smaller. It makes it honest. The gap between what a find actually demonstrates and what a headline wants it to mean is exactly the gap that swallowed sites like this one before, when confident claims outran the evidence supporting them. What can be said without exaggeration is enough on its own. Generations of people, choosing the same ground, along the same river, for reasons the land itself still remembers. The most interesting discoveries rarely need the biggest headline attached to them. This one doesn't either. What's provable here is already remarkable enough, without borrowing a superlative it hasn't earned. That piece of quartz is still sitting in a lab now, cataloged alongside pottery shards, hearthstone, and points made of 5 different kinds of rock, waiting to be measured, dated, and written into a report a handful of undergraduates will help author. It started as debris a farm worker almost didn't look at twice. It ended up rewriting, in a small but real way, what this stretch of Appalachian ground has been quietly doing for 8,000 years. Wright's own words cut closest to what this discovery actually means. Topography shapes how people live, then and now. A through line connecting ancient hunters to the farmers working this same soil today. Not because the story is about being first, because it's about being continuous. The dam that would have flooded this valley never got built. The road nobody paved here yet still traces a path people were already walking. Whether this exact ground ever earns the label oldest travel route in America is still an open question. One more site, one more season, one more layer might eventually answer. What isn't in question is simpler and, in the end, more durable. People kept choosing this exact spot for thousands of years, long before anyone thought to ask why. And somewhere beneath a garden that still grows vegetables every summer, the ground is still keeping count of every single one of them, quietly, the way it always has, waiting for the next person curious enough to ask what else might still be down there.
Thanks for watching this video, but before you go, don't let your DNA results just sit there unanswered. Tap the link on the description to download your ebook and find out what your raw data is hiding.